On a warm Georgia night, the church doors stood open, but what waited inside wasn't salvation. 2 lives ended in the quiet glow of the sanctuary, and a small town's faith was shattered. For decades, the truth hid in whispers and shadows, until someone dared to drag it into the light. It began as a quiet Monday night in March 1985, the kind of evening where the world seemed at peace, even in a place where history had rarely been gentle. Rising Daughter Baptist Church, a modest white cinderblock sanctuary built by African-American hands at the dawn of the 20th century, stood beneath a waning moon in the unincorporated community of Spring Bluff, Georgia. For generations, it had been more than a house of worship. It was a safe harbor, a community anchor, and a living link to ancestors who had survived slavery, Jim Crow, and the long shadow of segregation. Inside, 12 members of the church's mission department, 11 women and 1 man, were gathered for Bible study and fellowship. Leading them was 66-year-old Harold Swain, a deacon, community leader, and, to many, the unofficial mayor of Spring Bluff. His wife of 43 years, Thelma, sat at the front table, taking minutes in her meticulous hand. Around them were friends, neighbors, and even a young girl, all wrapped in the gentle rhythm of scripture and prayer. Outside, the spring air hung thick with the scent of marsh grass and damp earth. A single yellow bulb cast a weak halo above the church's front door. It was beneath this light that a stranger approached, a white man, tall and lean, with long hair and cowboy boots, dressed in dark clothing. He didn't knock. He didn't step directly into the sanctuary. Instead, he lingered in the vestibule, leaning against the wall as though waiting for something or someone. Vanzola Williams, preparing to leave early to pick up her daughter from work, was the first to encounter him. His voice was calm but direct. "I want to talk to somebody." When she asked who, he pointed toward Harold Swain. She relayed the message, and Harold rose from his pew, Bible still open to Ephesians, a book that speaks of divine love and unity even in a broken world. At first, the exchange between the 2 men seemed routine. Churches like Rising Daughter were used to strangers dropping by in need of food, gas money, or simply prayer. But within moments, the quiet turned into chaos. The vestibule erupted in a violent struggle. A handgun appeared. The sound of gunfire cracked through the sanctuary, shattering the air and sending congregants scrambling toward the rear exit. Thelma did not run. Instead, she rushed toward her husband's side, shouting that Harold had been shot. As she reached the vestibule, the gunman turned the weapon on her and fired again. She fell beside Harold, her hand touching the back of his head as if in a final act of comfort. For a long, agonizing moment, the church was silent except for the fading echoes of the shots. Some members hid in the pastor's study, others crouched in the darkened kitchen. With the phone lines cut, they could not call for help. Minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last. Finally, Marjorie Moore, the group's determined mission president, braved the night, broom in hand, and drove to the nearest store for help. When the first responders arrived, they found Harold and Thelma lying side by side in the vestibule, drenched in blood. The safe haven of Rising Daughter Baptist had been transformed into a crime scene. Outside, headlights from gathering cars illuminated the old cemetery, where generations of church members lay buried under moss-draped oaks. Inside, the newest chapter of Spring Bluff's history had been written in violence. For those who lived here, the shock was almost unbearable. The Swains were the kind of people who made a small community strong, generous, dependable, and deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. To imagine them gone, and in such a way, was to feel the ground shift beneath their feet. But the questions that took root that night, why here, why them, and who would dare, would prove even more enduring than grief, because the tide in Spring Bluff had turned, and it would not recede for decades. By the time Chief Sheriff's Deputy Butch Kennedy's cruiser rolled into the Rising Daughter churchyard, the scene was already glowing under a tangle of headlights. Cars, trucks, and emergency vehicles crowded the small patch of grass. Word had spread like lightning through Camden County, and each minute brought more relatives, neighbors, and stunned onlookers. Some stood in clusters, whispering theories. Others simply stared toward the church, as though trying to will the tragedy away. Kennedy, trim and clean-shaven at 40, stepped from his car with the muscle memory of 1,000 calls behind him. But nothing in his career had prepared him for this. The smell hit first, a bitter cocktail of gunpowder and perfume, as though Sunday morning and sudden death had collided in the same air. Then he saw them, Harold and Thelma, lying in the vestibule, side by side on the cold tile, their blood seeping into the pale grout lines. For a heartbeat, Kennedy stood frozen, one hand on the doorframe, the other reaching for the wall just to steady himself. He had known them. Everyone had. Harold with his easy wave outside Choo Choo Barbecue, Thelma with her ready smile in the aisles of the Brunswick grocery. And now this. He forced himself to switch into investigative mode. A cassette recorder appeared in his hand, his voice low and deliberate as he described the scene. 2 bodies, multiple shell casings, blood smeared across the vestibule floor. What he didn't record was the thought pounding in his skull. Whoever did this is out there, and they think they can get away with it. Outside, clusters of women from the mission department huddled together in the cool night air. They were still shaking, their eyes darting toward the dark tree line that bordered the churchyard. Vanzola Williams stood among them, her voice soft but steady as she recounted her brief encounter with the stranger in the vestibule. Kennedy zeroed in. "Could you recognize him if you saw him again?" he asked. Williams paused, then nodded. "I think I would. Yes, I think I would recognize him." Her description was clear. A white man in his 20s, long blonde hair hanging to his shoulders, dressed head to toe in black, cowboy boots. No sign of recognition in Harold's eyes when she introduced them. And one detail Kennedy hadn't expected. The calm way the man had simply pointed Harold out, as though this meeting had been planned. It was enough to ignite Kennedy's instincts, but not enough to point him in a single direction. In Camden County, plenty of trouble could come from outside. Interstate 95 ran less than 3 miles from the church, a direct artery for travelers, drifters, and, at times, predators. If the killer wasn't local, he could already be half a state away. Soon, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation rolled onto the scene, led by seasoned Agent Joe Gregory. Where Kennedy's face was still pale with shock, Gregory's was a mask of focus. He moved through the vestibule with methodical precision, stretching measuring tape, sketching the scene, marking where each piece of evidence lay. 3 pairs of glasses were noted, Harold's, Thelma's, and a third, mismatched pair with lenses scratched and oily. They didn't belong to any congregant. 2 hairs were caught in the hinge. In 1985, DNA testing was still in its infancy. To Gregory, those strands were more curiosity than breakthrough. But he bagged them anyway. Sometimes the smallest details solved the biggest cases. As the night deepened, so did the mystery. Phone lines to the church had been cut, a deliberate move, one that suggested premeditation. And yet, cash remained in Harold's wallet, in the women's purses, even in the collection plate. If this was a robbery, it was a strangely unfinished one. Just after midnight, the first whispers of motive began to ripple through the crowd. Some said it was a drifter, desperate for money. Others suggested a personal grudge. In the black community, there was another possibility, one rooted in bitter history. A white man walking into a historic African-American church, singling out the deacon, and shooting both him and his wife. It was impossible not to recall the countless acts of racial violence etched into the South's past. Whether investigators wanted to admit it or not, that shadow hung heavy over the night. By dawn, the shock had hardened into a grim resolve. The killer had vanished into the dark, but his act had left deep tracks. In the memories of the witnesses, in the bloodstains on the church floor, and in the fragile sense of safety that Spring Bluff had carried for generations. In the coming days, the investigation would fan out across South Georgia, chasing leads from gas stations to gun shops, from naval base gossip to whispered rumors in backwoods bars. But on that first night, one truth became inescapable. The tide had turned, and Rising Daughter Baptist would never again be just a sanctuary. Morning light crept over Spring Bluff the day after the murders, but for the survivors, it brought no relief. Sleep had been elusive. Every closed eye saw the same thing, the cracked vestibule door, the flash of metal, Harold's body folding under gunfire. Deputy Kennedy was already on the road by sunrise, heading toward his first witness interview. His unmarked Chevy Chevelle rattled over the sandy washboard roads, past stretches of pine forest where the air still smelled faintly of salt from the marshes. This was the part of the job he both dreaded and relied on, coaxing details from people who'd lived through horror, knowing each answer might hurt them but could also break the case. His first stop was the modest home of Cora Fisher, a 52-year-old homemaker who had been seated in the sanctuary just a few pews back from Thelma. Kennedy could see the trauma on her before she even spoke. Trembling hands, eyes darting to the corners of the room as though the killer might step out of the shadows. "When she pushed that door open," Fisher said, referring to Thelma, "I could see the pistol. He shot her just like that." She snapped her fingers, the sound sharp in the still kitchen. Kennedy leaned forward. "You saw his face?" Fisher's eyes locked onto his. "Looked right at me. Smiled." The idea chilled Kennedy. A man who could kill in a church and smile at a witness. That wasn't desperation, that was coldness. But something about the logistics nagged at him. In Gregory's sketch of the crime scene, a door should have been between Fisher and the shooter. Was it possible she had seen a shadow and her mind had filled in the rest? Trauma could etch memories deep, but it could also distort them. From there, Kennedy moved to Gwen Owens, a 34-year-old nurse who had attended with her 7-year-old daughter, Leslie. It was their first mission department meeting at Rising Daughter, and they had sat close enough to see the vestibule. Owens's recollection was deliberate and measured, her nurse's mind sorting details carefully. The man's hair, she said, was almost the color of Agent Sweat's. A dark brown, long, parted down the middle. He wore black-rimmed glasses, a navy or black shirt, and matching pants. She had seen him struggling with Harold before he turned away from the sanctuary. No mustache, she thought. Clean-shaven. Then there was Leslie's small but intriguing contribution. He had on some kind of black glasses and a red mustache and red hair. A child's impression, maybe colored by limited vocabulary. Red might have meant anything from auburn to strawberry blonde. But in an investigation, even the smallest inconsistencies could matter. By midweek, the sheriff's office had arranged for 4 of the women to sit with an identikit, the predigital collage method of building a suspect's face from paper eyes, noses, and hairlines. Each woman worked separately, building the man she remembered. The results were similar but not identical. 3 showed a young man with collar-length hair. Fisher's sketch, oddly, bore a resemblance to Mad Magazine's grinning mascot, Alfred E. Newman, an unsettling echo of her claim about the killer's smile. A Jacksonville Police Department artist then tried to merge their versions into a single composite. The result: a slender white man in his 20s with wavy, shoulder-length dirty blonde or light brown hair, a prominent chin, and no facial hair. Gwen Owens didn't like it. "That's not him," she said flatly, but protocol demanded it go public. The next morning, the face was everywhere, on wanted posters in gas stations, splashed across local TV, faxed to police departments in 3 states. And with the publicity came the calls. Tips poured in. A man seen acting strangely at the naval base. Another who'd visited a gun shop and spewed racist vitriol. A customer at a roadside store whose manner made the clerk uneasy. Kennedy and Gregory chased them all, weaving across county lines, knocking on doors in trailer parks, convenience stores, and backroad farmhouses. Each suspect was measured against the most tantalizing piece of physical evidence they had: the battered pair of glasses found inches from the Swains' bodies. The mismatched frames, scratched lenses, and crude welding repairs suggested someone without means or polish. But none of the suspects' prescriptions matched. 2 weeks in, they had investigated hundreds of leads, and still the killer was a ghost. For the investigators, the frustration was mounting. For the community, fear was setting in. And beneath it all, one question kept rising to the surface. Unspoken in some circles, openly voiced in others. Had this been about race? 5 days after the shooting, the rain came. It swept in off the marshes in heavy curtains, soaking the sandy roads and pooling around the churchyard of Rising Daughter Baptist. The weather seemed almost intentional, as if the sky itself refused to let the day pass quietly. That afternoon, the sanctuary filled beyond capacity. Rows of dark-wood pews held mourners shoulder to shoulder. Others stood pressed against the whitewashed walls. People had driven in from across Georgia and Florida. Family members, old friends, pastors from neighboring towns, and strangers who had simply read about the couple in the papers and wanted to bear witness. At the front were two matching cream-colored caskets with silver handles, positioned side by side. Harold and Thelma Swain, inseparable in life, lay together in death. Behind them, stained glass windows cast muted colors across the room, dimmed by the storm outside. The service began with a hymn, "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone?" And the sound swelled like a tide inside the small building. "There's a cross for everyone, and the cross for me." The voices were steady, but there was a weight in them. Not resignation, exactly, but the shared knowledge that this was a burden no one here had chosen and no one could ever set down. Family members spoke first. Each had been allotted 3 minutes, but many struggled to compress decades of memories. They told of Harold's early years on his grandparents' farm, his love for baseball. He had even seen Jackie Robinson play in person, and his tireless service as a deacon, Sunday school superintendent, and leader in the local NAACP. They spoke of Thelma's sharp wit, her dedication to the mission department, her gift for making everyone feel at home in her kitchen. The stories painted a picture of a couple who had built their lives around service, running the volunteer fire department from their own yard, pushing the county to build a ball field for local kids, taking in relatives who had nowhere else to go. When the time came, pallbearers carried the caskets out into the rain. Umbrellas dotted the cemetery as mourners followed to a plot near the back, shaded by ancient oaks heavy with Spanish moss. The new graves faced the sanctuary. Their shared headstone bore no inscription, just the image of 2 praying hands. While the community grieved, the investigation churned on. The composite sketch had sparked a flood of tips, but each lead seemed to evaporate under scrutiny. One man had been seen hanging around the Kings Bay Naval Base, behaving oddly. Another matched the sketch and had a reputation for racist outbursts at a local gun shop. A third walked into a Georgia State Patrol office to renew his driver's license and gave the clerk a bad feeling. Kennedy and Gregory ran down every name. They spoke to employers, friends, drinking buddies, even eye doctors, hoping one of them had prescribed the mismatched glasses found at the crime scene. None of the suspects fit. By the end of March, frustration hung over the case like the storm clouds that had soaked the funeral. That's when Sheriff Bill Smith called a press conference. Flanked by local pastors, NAACP leaders, and business owners, he announced a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, with the governor's office adding another $2,000. Reverend E.C. Tillman of Brunswick's Shiloh Baptist Church called the killings a desecration of the Lord's house. When reporters asked if the murders could have been racially motivated, Tillman acknowledged that some feared it, though he urged caution until the suspect was caught. Sheriff Smith was more blunt. "Race is not the issue, crime and robbery are the issue," he said, insisting the killer had likely been spooked and abandoned the robbery attempt. Not everyone agreed. Ben Fleming, a fellow deacon at Rising Daughter and a relative of Harold's, openly doubted robbery as a motive. Her pocketbook was there and his wallet. It seems like he would have taken one of them. The truth was, the sheriff's theory was no more proven than the community's fears. And as days turned into weeks, one thing was clear. The killer had vanished into the cracks between those competing narratives. To understand why the Rising Daughter murders unfolded the way they did, you have to know Camden County. Not just the salt marshes and winding rivers, but the power that flowed quietly, sometimes darkly, beneath its surface. On the water, Camden was a postcard. White egrets skimming above tidal creeks, shrimp boats easing into port, 5 rivers feeding the Atlantic in broad, glittering estuaries. But behind the charm, 2 forces had long dictated the county's rhythm: Gilman Paper Company and the Camden County Sheriff's Office. By the mid-1980s, Gilman Paper's grip was loosening. The giant mill still employed much of the local workforce, but its influence was being challenged by a new player, the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base. With it came new jobs, new residents, and, for some, the illusion of modern progress. Yet in Spring Bluff and other rural pockets, life looked much the same as it had for decades. The sheriff's office, on the other hand, was on the rise, particularly under its new leader, Bill Smith. Sworn in just 2 months before Harold and Thelma Swain were killed, Smith was young, handsome, and politically savvy. His campaign slogan, Camden County's man for the 80s, promised a modern, forward-thinking department. He'd courted the black vote with handshakes and photo ops, projecting himself as a unifier. But Smith was also the son of a dynasty. His father, Willie Smith, had been sheriff since 1942, a man as charming in public as he was ruthless when crossed. Civil rights leaders had accused Willie's deputies of harassing and even killing black residents. Only in the mid-1970s, after pressure from the local NAACP, led in part by Harold Swain's allies, did he hire 2 part-time black deputies. Bill Smith inherited not only the office but its political DNA. He cultivated alliances with the most powerful business interests through lavish parties at his ranch, nicknamed the Ponderosa, and, according to critics, extended a protective hand to friends in trouble with the law. Allegations of misuse of funds and favoritism followed him, but Smith brushed them off with a practiced smile. Into this environment came the most high-profile case Camden County had seen in years. The sheriff publicly vowed to solve it, but inside the department, not everyone was convinced the investigation was free from political currents. Deputy Kennedy, still pounding the pavement on leads, began to notice subtle shifts in focus. Certain suspects were pursued with vigor. Others, especially those with influential ties, seemed to be quietly deprioritized. Tips hinting at a racial motive were acknowledged but rarely followed far. And the theory of robbery, despite the untouched wallets and purses, remained the sheriff's favored narrative. Meanwhile, whispers spread that the killer might not be an outsider at all. Some locals suggested connections to small-time drug operations moving through the I-95 corridor. Others hinted at grudges buried in the county's tangled personal histories, the kind of old wounds that never made it into police reports but could fester for decades. For Kennedy and Gregory, every day brought more frustration. Leads went cold, suspects slipped away, and the battered pair of glasses from the crime scene, their best tangible clue, still refused to match anyone they could find. The investigation was stalling, and in Camden County, where power was often exercised behind closed doors and over quiet phone calls, a stalled investigation could be as good as a buried one. Spring Bluff was quiet on the surface, but just beyond the churchyard, the marshes and back roads were alive with talk. Every grocery line, gas pump, and front porch carried the same questions. Who did it? Why? And, just as importantly, why hasn't he been caught? Deputy Kennedy could feel the tension whenever he drove into the community. People watched his cruiser pass, some with hope, others with a skepticism that came from living in a place where justice often seemed selective. He and GBI agent Joe Gregory still chased every lead, but those leads were increasingly colored by rumor. Stories that mixed fact with fear until they were nearly inseparable. One story was about a man known for drifting along the I-95 corridor, picking up work where he could and leaving as quickly as he came. Another centered on a hot-headed local with a history of carrying a pistol and a tendency to settle arguments with his fists. Then there were the drug whispers. South Georgia in the mid-1980s was a smuggler's dream. The coastline was jagged with inlets and creeks, perfect for slipping a small boat in under cover of darkness. The barrier islands shielded the mainland from casual view, and the marshes swallowed footprints as fast as they were made. Small-time operators moved marijuana and cocaine through the backcountry, sometimes in the same trucks that hauled produce or lumber. Hunters told of stumbling across wrapped packages hidden under palmettos. And along I-95, deputies sometimes pulled over a drunk driver only to find cash stacked in the trunk. More than a year's salary for a working man. It wasn't lost on Kennedy and Gregory that a desperate or cornered smuggler could be capable of sudden violence. But tying that kind of underworld to the Swains' murder was another matter entirely. Harold and Thelma weren't the sort to involve themselves in anything illicit. Still, if the killer was tied to that world, it could explain both the boldness of the act and the silence that followed. The leads kept multiplying, each pulling the investigation in a different direction. A witness swore she'd seen a car matching the description, a medium brown Dodge Dart or Plymouth Duster, parked near the church earlier that night. Another claimed to know a man who had boasted about killing a preacher years ago, though the details were thin. Some tipsters were motivated by the $12,000 reward. Others seemed to just want their moment in the spotlight. Kennedy learned to separate the ones chasing headlines from the ones who hesitated before speaking, their eyes darting like they feared the walls had ears. In the middle of this swirl came something that felt like a break. A name surfaced. Someone who matched the composite sketch and whose life was tangled with minor crimes, angry outbursts, and the kind of behavior that made neighbors keep their distance. More than one caller identified him, and at least one witness hinted at a grudge against the Swains. Kennedy and Gregory closed in, quietly gathering what they could. But in Camden County, a promising lead could turn sour fast. One phone call to the wrong person, one piece of gossip reaching the ears of someone with influence, and the trail could vanish overnight. When they finally moved to dig deeper, they found the man suddenly insulated. His answers rehearsed, his connections to the case blurred under a fog of denials and conflicting stories. It was the first time Kennedy felt the investigation itself might be in danger, not from the killer, but from the forces that didn't want the truth to come out. And in Camden County, those forces could be as treacherous as any man with a gun. The man's name was already circulating in hushed conversations before Kennedy and Gregory had even put it in a report. He wasn't a stranger to trouble, had a record for petty crimes, temper like a hair trigger, and a way of walking into a room that made people instinctively take a step back. He matched the composite sketch closely enough to make the deputy's instincts hum. Longish hair, lean build, and a pair of glasses not unlike the battered set found beside Harold and Thelma. But getting close to him was proving harder than expected. By the time they'd lined up an interview, he'd already heard, from someone, that the sheriff's office was sniffing around. His demeanor was calm, almost bored, as if this was just another inconvenience to swat away. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I wasn't anywhere near that church. I've got nothing to do with it." On paper, his alibi was shaky. He claimed to have been home alone at the time of the murders. But there were gaps in his timeline, hours unaccounted for, and not a single witness to vouch for him. Behind closed doors, the case began to tighten like a vice. Gregory wanted to press harder, maybe even arrange a lineup. Kennedy agreed, but there were murmurs from higher up that they needed to be careful, that rushing things could complicate the case. It wasn't a direct order to back off, but it felt like one. The suspect, it turned out, wasn't without friends. He had ties to a local business owner who was well-connected, the sort of man who could get his phone calls returned quickly at the courthouse. Whether those ties were strong enough to sway the investigation was unclear, but in Camden County, perception could be as powerful as reality. Meanwhile, the community's patience was fraying. At Sunday services across the county, preachers urged congregants to pray for justice, but in living rooms and front porches, the tone was less hopeful. People whispered that the sheriff's office was protecting someone, that maybe the killer had already slipped away because the wrong leads were being followed. For Kennedy, it was a dangerous position. Too much pressure from the public could make the department clamp down even tighter, more concerned with managing appearances than catching the man who pulled the trigger. One evening, just as Kennedy was preparing to leave the office, the phone rang. It was the suspect. "What's the point of all this?" the man said, his voice tight. "I hope you'll find out who actually did it. I had nothing to do with this. I want it to stay where it is, gone." Kennedy hung up slowly, the words echoing in his head. It wasn't exactly a confession. It wasn't exactly a denial either, but it carried something else, a warning. From that point on, Kennedy and Gregory knew two things. The man was watching them just as closely as they were watching him, and the closer they got, the more dangerous the road ahead would become. The battered pair of glasses had been sitting in an evidence bag for weeks, almost mocking Kennedy every time he saw them. Thick, scratched lenses, mismatched arms, one bent and crudely welded. The hinge held two hairs, light brown or dirty blonde, caught there since the night Harold and Thelma died. If these belonged to the killer, they were more than just eyewear. They were a signature, a piece of him left behind when everything else had been wiped clean. Gregory took them to the GBI crime lab in Atlanta, where a technician examined them under harsh fluorescent light. The welding marks suggested the work of someone without professional tools, maybe a home repair with a soldering iron. The prescription, though, was precise enough to narrow a search. The detectives started calling optometrists across South Georgia and North Florida, reading out the measurements, asking if they'd ever filled a similar order. Each no added another dead end to the case file. But then one office hinted they might have had a patient in that range. The name they gave made Kennedy's pulse tick up. It was one he already knew from the suspect list. Inside the department, things were getting tense. Sheriff Bill Smith still leaned publicly on the robbery theory, pointing to the cut phone lines and the killer's escape without being seen. But Kennedy was starting to see a different picture, one where the glasses, the deliberate targeting of Harold, and the lack of stolen money pointed toward a personal motive. And yet, every time Kennedy pushed to focus on the suspect with the possible eyewear match, the conversation seemed to drift back to other leads. "We can't put all our eggs in one basket," he was told. "We've got to keep our options open." It sounded reasonable, but it felt like a brake being applied, just enough to keep them from gaining momentum. Out in the community, fear was changing shape. At first, people had been on edge in a general way, worried the killer might strike again. Now, the talk was more specific. Some believed they knew who it was, or at least knew the family. Others thought there was more than one person involved. At a small gas station off Highway 17, a man told Kennedy something that stuck with him. "If you ever do get him, you'll find out this ain't the first time he's pulled a gun on someone." It was an offhand comment, tossed out between pumps, but it wasn't the first time Kennedy had heard something like it. There were old stories, half forgotten, half whispered, about a man fitting the suspect's description being involved in other acts of violence in neighboring counties. Bar fights that ended with gunfire. A roadside argument that escalated to a beating. Nothing that had ever put him away for long, but enough to leave a trail of fear behind him. Gregory started to wonder aloud if they were looking at a man who didn't just kill out of opportunity, but out of compulsion. Someone who could be set off by the smallest spark. If that was true, Rising Daughter wasn't a botched robbery. It was the latest eruption from a fuse that had been burning for years. But proving it meant more than just suspicion. They needed witnesses willing to talk, evidence that couldn't be explained away, and a department willing to back them when the moment came to move. And in Camden County in 1985, that last part might be the hardest to find. It started with a call from a number Kennedy didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was low, hesitant, and clearly weighing every word before letting it out. "I heard you're still asking about that church shooting," the man said. Kennedy confirmed he was. "I don't want my name in any report," the caller warned. "But I think I know who that man is. And it ain't the first time he's put his hands on somebody." The caller spun a story that was both familiar and disturbing. Years earlier, in a neighboring county, there had been an incident at a roadside bar. A fight over nothing, a flash of temper, and suddenly a gun was out. The description of the aggressor matched the Rising Daughter suspect down to the long hair and the angular jaw. In that case, no one had pressed charges. Witnesses had backed out, saying they didn't see enough to be sure. But the man on the phone insisted everyone in that bar had known exactly who it was. They'd just been too scared to testify. Gregory dug into old incident reports. There it was. A thin file, the kind that could vanish in a pile of paperwork without anyone noticing. The victim had suffered a grazing gunshot wound. The suspect had left before deputies arrived. The names in the report were familiar, not just the suspects, but a cousin who was well connected in the county. The file ended abruptly with the note, "Case inactive, no willing witnesses." It was exactly the kind of history that made Kennedy's stomach knot. If this man had gotten away with violence before, what were the odds he'd be emboldened to do it again? Then came another piece, this time from a woman who had grown up in Spring Bluff and still had family there. She told Kennedy she'd been at the church on the night of the murders, but had never spoken publicly about what she saw after fleeing. Her account was unlike the others. She claimed that as she and another congregant hid in the shadows outside, they'd seen the killer leave through the side door, not running, but walking briskly toward a car parked partially under the trees. She remembered the taillights flashing as he started the engine, the shape of the rear bumper, even a missing hubcap on the passenger side. When Kennedy asked why she hadn't come forward earlier, her answer was chilling. You ever heard the saying, "Dead men tell no tales"? Well, neither do the living if they want to stay that way. I know what happens to people who talk too much around here. The more they pushed, the more the walls seemed to close in. A call from a contact in another county hinted that state-level officials were starting to take an interest in the case, but it wasn't clear whether that meant help or interference. The phrase "don't rock the boat" began to crop up in conversations with people who had nothing to gain by saying it. For Kennedy and Gregory, the math was changing. They were no longer just chasing a killer. They were navigating a web of fear, loyalty, and influence that had been part of Camden County's DNA for generations. And if the killer was inside that web, pulling at its strands, then every move they made could be watched, and every question they asked could make them a target, too. It came from the last place Kennedy expected, a mechanic's shop in a small town 2 counties over. He'd stopped there chasing down yet another dead-end lead on the battered glasses. But the man behind the counter, wiping grease from his hands, had something else to say. "You're looking for a fella with home-welded frames?" the mechanic asked, leaning over the counter. "Yeah, I've seen a pair like that. Belonged to a guy came through here a while back, needing work done on his car. Thought he was gonna stiff me on the bill." The description he gave matched the composite sketch almost exactly. Tall, lean, long hair, and a way of speaking that suggested both arrogance and unpredictability. But it was what the mechanic said next that froze Kennedy in place. He had a busted-up Duster, brown, missing a hubcap on the passenger side. It was the detail the hidden witness from Spring Bluff had whispered about. The car she'd seen pulling away from the church the night Harold and Thelma were murdered. Kennedy didn't let the excitement show, but inside, his thoughts were racing. If they could tie that car to the suspect, they'd have more than just a face and a rumor. They'd have a piece of physical evidence that could put him at the scene. Gregory moved fast. They tracked registration records, checked old tickets, and found that the suspect had indeed owned a car of that description. But in a frustrating twist, the vehicle had been sold months after the murders, traded off to a buyer in another state. The trail was cold, but not impossible. That night, the political undercurrents came roaring back. Sheriff Bill Smith called Kennedy into his office, the blinds drawn even though it was after dark. He congratulated Kennedy on making progress, but his tone carried an edge, like the compliment was meant to steer more than praise. "We've got to be smart about this," Smith said. "Don't go kicking over any rocks you don't have to. We're all on the same team here." Kennedy nodded, but he could feel the warning under the words. It wasn't the first time Smith had hinted that certain angles might cause trouble. In the days that followed, Kennedy noticed something else. Conversations he'd had in confidence seemed to be getting back to the suspect's circle. A question he'd asked a witness one afternoon was met with a cryptic phone call from an old friend that evening, advising him to let it go. Whether it was paranoia or fact, Kennedy began to suspect the investigation had leaks, and that each step forward risked alerting the very man they were hunting. Still, the image of that brown Duster kept burning in his mind. Somewhere there was a trail of parts, of maintenance records, maybe even of the hubcap itself, and if they could follow it, it might lead straight to the truth. But in Camden County, the truth had a way of exacting a price. And Kennedy was starting to realize that before this was over, he'd have to decide just how much he was willing to pay. Tracking the brown Duster meant stepping outside familiar territory, both geographically and politically. The paperwork trail took Kennedy and Gregory into a neighboring county where the suspect's family name carried weight. The kind of weight that could buy silence in a hurry. The address tied to the car's last known registration led them to a rural property at the end of a dirt lane, flanked by rusted farm equipment and a line of pecan trees. Even before they knocked, Kennedy felt the air shift. The front porch held 2 men in ball caps, arms crossed, watching their approach with an expressionless stare. "We're looking for the owner of a Plymouth Duster," Gregory began, holding out a badge. One of the men spat into the dirt. "Don't know nothing about that." The conversation went in circles. Yes, they knew the man who'd bought the car. No, he wasn't around. No, they didn't know where it had gone. And no, they couldn't recall anything useful about the missing hubcap or the repair work. Every question met with a flat wall. Kennedy could feel the hostility under the surface. Not loud or threatening, just steady, like a warning hum in the background. These weren't people eager to help law enforcement, especially when the trail led toward one of their own. Back at the motel that night, Kennedy found a note slipped under his door. No name, no signature, just 4 words written in block letters. "You're pushing too hard." He showed it to Gregory. They didn't need to discuss what it meant. In small communities, threats weren't always shouted. Sometimes they arrived in whispers or folded paper. Then came the ally Kennedy hadn't expected. A man who'd worked at a scrapyard called to say he remembered the duster. It had been brought in years ago for dismantling. "Didn't think much of it at the time," he admitted. "But I remember that busted hubcap. Thing had been riding on 3 good wheels for months." More importantly, the man had kept records, old intake forms that might still be boxed in the back office. If they could find the VIN number, they could link the car definitively to the suspect. But the scrapyard was in the same county as the property they just visited, and the owner was wary. "I don't want no trouble," he told Kennedy. "If I give you this, you didn't get it from me." The next day, they drove out to the yard. The records were there, dusty, yellowed, but legible. The VIN number matched the registration from the suspect's ownership period. On paper, they now had a thread tying him to a vehicle that could have been seen fleeing Rising Daughter the night of the murders. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was more than they'd had in months. As they drove back, Kennedy couldn't shake the feeling they were being followed. A set of headlights lingering too long in the rearview, a slow turn behind them even after they changed direction. The closer they got to the truth, the more the air around them seemed to thicken. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a race against whatever forces were quietly making sure this case never reached a courtroom. The first time Kennedy noticed the headlights, he told himself it was nothing. Just a local on the same route, heading home. But the second night it happened, and the third it stopped feeling like coincidence. The car always hung back just far enough to blur its features, but close enough to remind him it was there. Every turn he made, it made too. Every detour, every change of speed, the gap remained the same. Gregory saw it as well. "We're not just stirring up dust anymore," he muttered. "We're stepping in something." The suspect's circle wasn't just family. It was a loose network. Friends from childhood, old drinking partners, people who owed him favors or feared his temper. Some had known him long enough to dismiss his violent streak as just how he was. Others, Kennedy suspected, knew far more than they would ever admit. What worried him most was how quickly their questions seemed to travel back to the man they were asking about. Conversations held over coffee in one county would come back to him through a helpful phone call in another. The message between the lines was always the same: "You're being watched." Then the pressure took a new shape. The scrapyard contact called, voice low and tense. "Somebody came asking about you," he said. "Wanted to know if I'd talk to you. I didn't tell them nothing, but you need to know they're checking." Kennedy thanked him, but inside, the knot in his gut tightened. It was one thing to be followed. It was another to have witnesses, already skittish, realize they might be next in line for intimidation. At the same time, the case files were growing heavier with fragments. The glasses, the brown duster, the whispered barroom gunfight years before, the partial eyewitness account of the killer's exit. None of it was airtight, but together it formed the outline of a man who had been dangerous for a long time and who had slipped through the cracks more than once. Gregory began pushing for a coordinated move. Bring in state investigators, hit every connected lead at once, overwhelm the suspect's support system before it could close ranks. But that meant going over Sheriff Smith's head, and in Camden County that could be as dangerous as confronting the suspect himself. One night, over coffee in a near-empty diner, Kennedy put it into words. "If we keep playing it safe, this case dies," he said. "But if we push, we'd better be ready for what comes back at us." Gregory didn't hesitate. "Then we push." It was a simple answer, but both men knew it marked a turning point. From here on, they weren't just hunting the man who killed Harold and Thelma. They were moving directly against the web that had been protecting him. And in Camden County, that web could be just as lethal as a gun in the vestibule. The plan wasn't formal. It wasn't written down or run through official channels. Kennedy and Gregory knew that if they tried to run it up the ladder, it would either stall or leak before it got anywhere. So they kept it tight, just the two of them and a handful of state investigators they trusted. They called it shaking the tree. The idea was simple. Hit every peripheral contact in the suspect's circle in a single sweep. No warning, no pattern. Knock on doors, ask pointed questions. Leave them with the sense that the investigation was suddenly moving faster and closer than anyone realized. If the suspect was still feeling untouchable, this was meant to rattle him. Day one of the push began at sunrise. They started with an old friend of the suspect's, a man who'd been with him during the bar shooting years earlier. He claimed to remember nothing, but his hands wouldn't stay still, and every other sentence ended with, "I don't want to get involved." By mid-morning, they were at the home of a cousin who'd helped him work on the duster. The cousin insisted he hadn't seen the car in years. When Kennedy mentioned the missing hubcap, the man flinched, a tiny reaction, but one Kennedy filed away. By the second day, the effect was showing. Kennedy got word from a contact that the suspect had been seen driving out of town, alone, late at night. Not his usual pattern. Gregory's take was blunt. He's spooked. That afternoon, a tip landed that made both men sit up straighter. Someone, anonymous of course, had called a local payphone, asking questions about whether the cops had anything on the church thing. The voice, the informant said, sounded nervous, like he was fishing for what you knew. If the suspect was starting to make moves, that meant they were getting close. But it also meant he might try to shut down anyone he thought could connect him to the scene. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Kennedy was leaving a witness's property late one evening when he saw the suspect's car idling at the end of the dirt drive. The lights were on, but the engine was quiet. The driver's window was down. "You got a lot of questions," the suspect called out as Kennedy's headlights swept over him. His voice was flat, but there was a charge underneath, the kind of voltage that could snap without warning. Kennedy kept his own tone even. "Still looking for the man who killed Harold and Thelma Swain." The suspect smirked. "Good luck with that." Then, almost lazily, he put the car in gear and rolled off into the dark. It was over in less than a minute, but it left Kennedy with the unmistakable sense that the lines were now clearly drawn. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was a standoff. 2 days after that roadside standoff, Kennedy got the call he'd been dreading. The woman who'd described seeing the killer's brown duster leaving the churchyard was gone. Her niece reported that she'd packed a single bag, left her house unlocked, and vanished without telling anyone where she was headed. No one had heard from her since. It wasn't the kind of disappearance that set off alarms in Camden County. People came and went all the time, but Kennedy knew this wasn't random. She had been their most direct link between the killer and the car. And now, just as the pressure was building, she was out of reach. Gregory's jaw tightened when Kennedy told him. She didn't just leave. Somebody made sure she wanted to leave. They started quietly asking around. Neighbors, relatives, even the clerk at the gas station where she stopped for coffee most mornings. One detail stuck. A man in a truck, unfamiliar to the locals, had been parked near her house several times in the week before she vanished. Dark blue Chevy, no plates on the front bumper. The description didn't match anyone in their files, but it was enough to feed Kennedy's growing suspicion. The suspect wasn't acting alone. With the witness gone, the circle tightened. Gregory proposed something bold. Put the suspect under quiet, round-the-clock watch. If they couldn't get him through cooperative witnesses, maybe they could catch him making a mistake. It was risky. They'd have to use people they could trust completely. No one from inside the sheriff's office who might tip him off. And they'd have to do it without official authorization, or risk being shut down. Kennedy agreed. We're past playing by the book. They set it up in layers. A borrowed pickup with out-of-county plates parked down the road from the suspect's place. A state investigator's unmarked sedan trailing at a distance when he drove. A fishing boat anchored near a creek that backed up to his property, watching for any unexpected visitors. The first 2 days were uneventful. Grocery runs, a trip to a feed store, hours sitting on his porch drinking beer. But on the third night, just after 11 p.m., he left. No lights, no obvious destination, just the crunch of gravel and the slow roll of the duster's tires down the lane. Gregory followed. For more than an hour, the suspect drove aimlessly, switching highways, doubling back, pulling into empty lots and sitting there. It was the kind of tale designed to shake anyone following him. Twice, Gregory nearly lost him. And then, without warning, the duster turned down a narrow dirt road that led into heavy pine. By the time Gregory reached the turn, the road was empty. No taillights, no sound of an engine. The suspect had vanished into the trees. It was a message, as clear as any words. I see you, and I can lose you whenever I want. The next evening, Gregory insisted they try again. We can't let him spook us off, he said. If we do, he'll know we're the ones who blinked. They set up the same way, layered coverage, different vehicles, staggered distances. Just before dusk, the suspect emerged from his house, this time with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He tossed it in the back seat of the duster and pulled away. Kennedy was 2 miles out when the radio crackled. Gregory's voice was tight. He's headed for the same road as last night. They followed the twists and dips until the headlights of the duster disappeared again into the pines. But this time, Kennedy was close enough to see the faint red glow of brake lights through the trees. Gregory pulled over, killed his engine. The night was still except for the sound of crickets and the distant hum of the interstate. Then movement. A figure stepped into the dirt road ahead of them, holding something long in one hand. Kennedy's hand went to the grip of his service weapon before he realized the figure wasn't the suspect. It was another man, tall, stocky, wearing a hunting cap pulled low. He stood in the center of the road, unmoving. Gregory tried easing forward, but the man didn't budge. When they were 20 feet away, he raised the object in his hand. The beam of a high-powered flashlight blasted into their windshield, blinding them. By the time Kennedy's vision cleared, the man was gone, swallowed by the trees. It was no coincidence. Someone knew their route. Someone knew exactly where they'd be that night. And that meant the suspect's network wasn't just passive. It was actively running counter-surveillance on them. Back in town, Kennedy sat in the diner staring into his coffee. He's not just being careful, he said. He's sending us warnings. And every time we ignore one, he ups the ante. Gregory agreed. Which means the next move might not be a warning. The next morning, Kennedy's tires were slashed. All four. No note, no signature. Just the hiss of rubber and the understanding that it could have just as easily been something worse. The escalation was clear. The missing witness was the first. The shadowing on the road was the second. Now the suspect wasn't going to let them box him in quietly. It forced a hard decision. They could keep building quietly and risk losing more witnesses, maybe even their own safety, or they could shove the case into the open, force it into a spotlight so bright it would be harder for anyone to make it disappear. Gregory leaned in over the diner table. We've been circling him for months. Maybe it's time we stop circling. Kennedy didn't answer right away, because circling was safe, and stepping in would mean everything after that point would move fast and possibly spiral beyond their control. The decision came on a Sunday morning, just before dawn. Kennedy sat at his kitchen table, a stack of photographs and reports spread out in front of him like a grim mosaic. The glasses, the duster, the barroom shooting file, the missing witness. Every piece was circumstantial on its own, but together they formed a story he could no longer keep quiet. By the time the sun rose, he and Gregory were in agreement. They would go public, not with the whole case file, but with enough to make it impossible for the suspect's allies to quietly smother the investigation. They started with the local paper. Kennedy met the editor in the back booth of a quiet cafe, sliding a manila envelope across the table. Inside were photographs of the glasses, the composite sketch, and a summary of the car description. "This is as far as I can go without putting people at risk," Kennedy said. "But if you print it, it's out there. Everyone sees it. No one can pretend they don't know we have a suspect in mind." The editor, a wiry man who'd been in Camden County long enough to understand its unwritten rules, studied Kennedy's face for a long moment before nodding. "You realize once this runs, there's no putting the lid back on." "I do," Kennedy replied. The article hit the front page 2 days later. Church murders. New details emerge in long-running case. It laid out the basic facts: the glasses, the car, the reward money still unclaimed, and it made one thing clear. Investigators believed someone in Camden County knew the killer's identity. By noon, Kennedy's phone was ringing non-stop. Some callers offered tips, some offered denials, and some offered threats thinly veiled as advice. One call stood out. A man said he'd worked briefly with the suspect on a construction crew and remembered him showing up with a deep scratch along his cheek just days after the murders. He'd brushed it off at the time, but now, hearing about the case again, it didn't sit right. The reaction from the sheriff's office was immediate and cold. Sheriff Smith summoned Kennedy to his office, the door closing with a heavy click. "You went outside the chain," he said, voice tight. "You've just made this department a target for every crank and gossip in the county." "With respect," Kennedy replied. "The case was dying in the dark. This way, it's harder for anyone to bury it." Smith didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, eyes unreadable. "Just remember, Deputy, when you shine a light, you can't control what it lands on." That afternoon, Gregory spotted the suspect for the first time since the article ran. He was standing outside a hardware store, talking to two men. When Gregory pulled into the lot, all three looked up. The suspect smiled, slow, deliberate, and tapped the bridge of his nose, as if to say, "I see you." The game had changed. The shadows were gone. And now, both sides were moving in full view. 3 days after the article hit, the phone call came. The woman's voice was trembling, but not from fear, from the urgency of finally letting go of something she'd been holding for years. "I saw him that night," she said. "Not at the church, but right after. I was driving home from my sister's, just past 11, when that brown duster came flying out of a side road. It nearly hit me. The driver, I swear it was him." Kennedy asked why she hadn't spoken up before. Her answer was the same refrain he'd heard too many times. "Because around here, talking about certain people is a good way to end up hurt." But now that the paper had gone public, she felt the tide turning. "If everybody's talking about it, maybe it's not just me sticking my neck out." Gregory met her in person the next morning. She gave a detailed description of the car, the missing hubcap, the dull paint, the passenger side mirror hanging loose. More importantly, she remembered the driver's expression. "He looked wired," she said, "like somebody who'd just been in a fight. His eyes were wide, and he kept glancing in the mirror like he thought someone was chasing him." The detail wasn't just vivid. It matched what they'd already suspected about his temperament that night. But going public had another effect, one they'd anticipated, but not this soon. The suspect was no longer keeping a low profile. He began appearing in public more, almost tauntingly, sitting outside the diner, leaning against his car at the gas station, lingering in parking lots just long enough for word to get back to Kennedy. One afternoon, Kennedy walked into the hardware store and found him there, leaning on the counter, chatting with the clerk. He turned just enough to catch Kennedy's eye, then said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Seems like people been talking a lot about me lately." No one laughed. No one spoke. The air in the room went taut, like the moment before a fight breaks out in a bar. That same week, another tip landed, this one from a former coworker of the suspect's cousin. He claimed that in the months after the murders, the suspect had suddenly come into extra cash, despite having no steady job. He was buying drinks for everybody at the bar, flashing 20s, the man said. When someone asked where it came from, he just grinned and said, "Don't worry about it." The detail was thin, but it fit the theory Gregory had been developing, that the murders hadn't been random, but a targeted act with a payoff involved. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time, Kennedy felt like the suspect might actually slip. Recklessness had always been part of his nature, and now that his name was buzzing through every back room in Camden County, his need to assert control, to show he wasn't afraid, could push him into making a mistake they could seize on. The challenge was simple but dangerous. They'd have to be close enough to catch that mistake when it happened. And in the kind of game they were playing now, close meant stepping directly into the suspect's line of fire. It happened at the Spring Bluff Town Fair, a place the suspect rarely visited in years past. But this time he showed up in the middle of the afternoon, swaggering through the crowd as if daring someone to confront him. Kennedy and Gregory had been there on another matter, following up on a tip about a local who might have worked on the duster. They spotted him almost immediately. Faded denim jacket, ball cap pulled low, cigarette in hand. But what caught their attention wasn't his presence. It was who he was with. Standing beside him was a man they both recognized from old arrest reports. A petty criminal with a history of running errands for bigger players. The two men drifted toward the beer tent, where the suspect leaned close, speaking low. The other man nodded, glanced around, and slipped a folded envelope into his jacket pocket. Gregory's eyes locked on the exchange. "You see that?" "Yeah," Kennedy said, already moving. They couldn't make an arrest, not without knowing what was in the envelope, but they could make their presence known. Gregory cut a path through the crowd, stopping just short of the suspect's table. "Afternoon," he said casually. "Enjoying the fair?" The suspect smirked. "Always do." He stubbed out his cigarette, leaned back in his chair, and added, "You boys sure are spending a lot of time in my business lately." "Maybe your business is our business," Kennedy replied evenly. For a split second, something flashed in the suspect's eyes. Not fear, exactly, but irritation at having his performance interrupted. Then, without another word, he stood, motioned to his companion, and walked away. The opportunity came an hour later. A fair volunteer, an older man with no love for the suspect, approached Kennedy quietly. "That fella you're watching? He and his buddy just headed for the parking lot. And your buddy with the cap?" He dropped that envelope. The volunteer handed it over. Inside were 4 crisp $50 bills and a torn sheet of paper with a phone number written in block letters. No name, no explanation. It wasn't enough to tie directly to the murders, but it hinted at something bigger, maybe payoff money, maybe hush money. And now they had physical evidence the suspect might not even realize was missing. The question was what to do with it. Gregory wanted to press their advantage, start pulling phone records, lean on the man who'd taken the envelope, maybe even haul him in. But Kennedy hesitated. Every time they tried to move a piece on the board, they risked tipping off the suspect's allies inside the department. "What if we play it wrong?" Kennedy said. "And it all leaks back before we've got him locked in?" Gregory's answer was blunt. "Then we've got to find someone outside the county who can move on this faster than they can cover it up." That meant taking the next step, reaching beyond Camden County's tangled loyalties and pulling in help from investigators who had no stake in keeping the suspect safe. But it also meant fully committing to a course that could put them in direct opposition to their own chain of command. And once that line was crossed, there would be no turning back. The call went out to an investigator Kennedy knew from his academy days, someone now working with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. They met in a rest stop parking lot halfway between Camden County and Savannah. No paper trail, no official request. Kennedy slid the envelope across the hood of his car. "We think it's connected to him. We need the number traced without it hitting our system." The GBI man didn't hesitate. "Give me a week." It was a risk, bypassing the sheriff's office entirely, but Kennedy and Gregory knew they couldn't afford the usual channels. If the number led anywhere solid, it could be their first real pivot from suspicion to proof. The reaction inside the department was almost immediate. 2 days later, Kennedy was called into Sheriff Smith's office again. This time, the door wasn't just closed, it was locked. Smith sat behind his desk, jaw tight. "I've been hearing you're talking to people outside the county," he said. "That's not how we operate here." "With respect," Kennedy replied. "It's the only way to keep this thing from disappearing again." Smith leaned forward. "You're playing a dangerous game. You think the rules don't apply to you, you're going to find out how wrong you are." That night, Gregory found his truck windshield smashed. Nothing taken, nothing vandalized except for the shattering glass. No note, no signature. But they didn't need one. The message was the same as always. You're stepping where you don't belong. 3 days later, The GBI contact called. "Got your number," he said. "It's a burner. But it pinged a tower near Brunswick the night after the murders. And you're gonna love this. That tower's a mile from the suspect's cousin's place." It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a direct line tying a fresh piece of evidence to the suspect's known associates. Gregory grinned when he heard it. "That's it. That's the thread. We pull it hard enough, something's gonna come loose." But they didn't get a chance to pull it quietly. The next morning, the suspect himself showed up at the station. He didn't ask for an appointment. He walked in, leaned on the front counter, and said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "You boys keep poking around in my life. I might have to start poking back." The room went silent. No one moved. Kennedy locked eyes with him, reading the challenge for what it was. The final move was coming. The only question was whether they'd be the ones to make it, or whether he would. The breaking point came on a sweltering Thursday evening. Kennedy and Gregory were sitting in an unmarked sedan outside the suspect's cousin's place, running a quiet watch. The plan was simple. See who came and went, match faces to names, build the net tighter. But just after dusk, the suspect's brown duster rolled into view. It slowed, idled for a moment at the gate, then pulled into the yard. Kennedy grabbed his camera, snapping frame after frame as the suspect got out, duffel bag in hand. What happened next changed everything. A man stepped out from the house, the same one who'd been with the suspect at the town fair, the one who'd taken the envelope. The suspect tossed him the duffel. The man unzipped it just enough for Kennedy to glimpse what looked like a pistol grip inside. Then he zipped it shut, glanced over his shoulder, and the two disappeared into the house. Gregory exhaled slowly. "We've got him moving weapons. That's federal if we can prove it." It was enough to make a call, not to the sheriff but to their GBI contact. Within the hour, 2 unmarked state cars were parked out of sight down the road. The decision was made. If the duster left, they'd follow, and they'd stop it the moment they had cause. Just after midnight, the headlights appeared again. The duster turned onto the main road, moving faster than usual. Gregory slipped in behind, the state cars slotting in at a distance. A few miles later, the suspect rolled through a stop sign without even slowing. That was the opening. Lights flared in the dark. The duster swerved, tried to accelerate, but a state unit boxed him in. Within seconds, the road was lit with red and blue. Kennedy approached the driver's side, hand resting on his holster. The suspect sat behind the wheel, jaw tight, eyes locked on Kennedy. "You mind stepping out?" Kennedy asked. For a long beat, the suspect didn't move. Then he opened the door, slow and deliberate. As he stepped into the light, Gregory opened the duffel on the passenger seat. Inside was a sawed-off shotgun, shells, and a folded piece of paper with an address, the home of a man who'd recently given Kennedy a statement about the duster. It was enough. Cuffed and read his rights, the suspect still wore the same crooked half-smile, but there was something different in his eyes now. Not confidence, but calculation, as if weighing just how much he was willing to say. The trial was still months away, and the murder charges would take time to build. But in that moment, Kennedy and Gregory had done what no one thought possible in Camden County. They had broken the shield around the man long whispered about in the shadows. As the state units pulled away with their prisoner, Gregory glanced at Kennedy. "Think he ever believed this day would come?" Kennedy shook his head. "I think he believed we'd quit. That's the only thing he was wrong about." And in the humid Georgia night, with the duster finally parked for good, the long hunt for Harold and Thelma's killer had taken its first real step toward the justice they deserved.